Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Winter, and this is the Starcraft update where I update you on every major change in Starcraft 2 and what's coming up next. Tomorrow, as of this video or anytime you watch it in the near future, one of the most major patches outside of expansions will be hitting. Patch 3.8 will include several major things. One, the conclusion of Nova Covert Ops mission pack. 2, another co-op mission. 3, a map pool change on the ladder. And 4, and possibly most importantly, especially what I'm going to be spending the most time on, is a major set of multiplayer balance changes affecting all the races dramatically. So that's going to be the main focus here. I'm going to run through everything before that, all the Nova Covert Ops changes, stuff like that, and then we'll get to the balance changes where I'm going to spend a lot more time on, because I have some strong opinions and analysis as a random player especially as well. But we're going to go right through these patch notes here. Patch 3.8 live on November 22nd. The third mission pack for Nova Covert Ops is now available. And, of course, the same way if you played the other mission packs, you can find it in the same manner. You find it on your campaign screen. And there's a new blog. We can actually do a quick video here. I'm going to go to the video in a second. But we also have a new co-op map, Minor Evacuation. I'm just going to run it down real quick. Pretty much Minor Evacuation is you have to go to certain objectives around the map where the colonists are loading up, trying to evacuate from the infested Zerg. And they're like infested siege tanks and a bunch of zombies and stuff like that. Well, Zerg zombies. Infested Terran, I'm sorry. So it's kind of like a reverse of the shuttle mission where you're trying to save the points against the shuttles. You actually have to go out on the map to different locations in order to save the colonists or whatever. So it's pretty interesting. New Black Ops trophy. Ooh, new trophies. I like trophies. And a new portrait. On top of that, we have a new portrait and decal bundle for Carbot especially. WCS Global Finals Portrait Bundle. If you watch the stream in the next few days, I'll have that. I've already bought that. The collection now supports dynamic bundle purchases, price adjusted accordingly. I know there were some people asking for that especially. The region switcher button has returned. Yeah, cool. You could switch from the login screen, not really a big deal, but new API endpoint. This is more for ranking sites if you use SC2 replay stats or sites like that. That's where that comes into play. But I'm just going to do the quick Nova Covert Ops video before we dive into these multiplayer balance changes. I've been having a lot of fun with Nova Covert Ops, so I'll probably have a video up on it in a day or two, and I'm sure there'll be plenty out there. And, of course, if you haven't played through in-game, now's your chance. But here we go, Nova Covert Ops. Spoilers. This is spoilers, by the way, so skip the next 30 seconds of the video if you don't want spoilers. But let's take a look at this one.
There's not much time left, Emperor. I know.
Your orders are to kill that boy.
As long as she's out there, more civilians will die.
Nova, I'm counting on you.
I've got it covered.
You've made a powerful enemy today.
So have you.
All right, so the epic conclusion there. I look forward to that tomorrow. All right, and now finally, one more thing. New ladder maps. We're kind of going back a little intentionally. The idea here, all the ladder maps for the next season are from previous seasons. The idea is because of all these massive balance changes happening kind of the off-season between WCS, Blizzard wants people to have a very comfortable map pool in which to test out these changes, so they're not only testing out the balance changes, but also having to adapt to new maps and stuff. So it's going to be a relatively short season, but you've got some old school maps you might recognize if you've been playing a while, especially Daybreak, Vanny, I don't know, the Research Station, Echo, Habitation Station, Overgrowth, welcome back again, Newkirk Precinct, and Whirlwind. So that's going to be your map pool for the next month or two while we do the balance changes. And now the real meat the major balance changes, major balance patch for multiplayer. The idea here, so apparently, according to Blizzard, I attended the multiplayer panel at BlizzCon. And according to Blizzard, the idea is to eventually get the game to a point where it either doesn't need any changes or only needs very small changes. So currently the plan is not like every year or something to be doing another big, nearly expansion level change to multiplayer. That's how comprehensive these are. We've got dozens of changes between the races. The idea is to eventually get the game to a point where, almost like a game like chess or something, new strategies can evolve, but it doesn't require Blizzard to be actively changing up the units. So we'll have to see if we can get there, but this is kind of to shake it up and go more in the direction that Blizzard wants to go for the game, and that's kind of the thought process behind it. Alright, so, Terran. Biological compositions feel in a pretty great place right now for Terran, but we believe it is essential for the race to have more diversity. So that means mech, factory, starport, and some unit redesigns as well. This isn't 100% accurate and updated, but there are a couple last-minute changes they've updated as well, but I'll talk about those. The Cyclone is being redesigned into a frontline anti-armor damage dealer, built from reactors. It's a pretty big deal as well, being able to build it from reactors. Supply cost decreased from 4 to 3, health increased 120 to 180, movement speed slowed down, and no longer requires a tech lab. Cost reduced from 150, 125 to 150, 100. I didn't actually realize it was 150, 125. I do now. But the lock-on now targets air only. So, a difference from the Cyclone as it is now, the Cyclone, instead of locking on to each unit and doing additional damage and being able to move around, it now just kind of think of it more like a mech marauder. It does a lot of anti-armor damage. And you see here, 18 to plus 3, but it attacks every 0.1 second. So the DPS, especially against armored, is significantly increased. And alongside the fact you can produce more for less supply with reactors and with the increased HP, makes it more of a frontline anti-armor unit. It's very effective in the early mid-game. Now, there's been a slight change here, where because people were just massing up so many Cyclones on the test map, myself included, especially against Protoss early on, the range has been slightly reduced from 5 to 4. 5, for comparison, is the range of a Marine. And they've given it a new upgrade. Magfield launchers to increase the range from 4 to 6. The idea here is, instead of just massing up a bunch of Cyclones right at the beginning of the game and just pushing with like 4 Cyclones, now you kind of combine it into your early mid-game unit composition. And we're talking about the time before you're able to really get a third base. We're more talking about before you really need siege tanks or Thors, you can use Cyclones to ward away groups of roaches, or blink stalkers, stuff like that. It's a more mobile unit, but eventually you're going to move up and need siege tanks and stuff like that. Now, a big one, the siege tank. A health increase, but this is because siege tanks can no longer be lifted by medevacs. So that's a big nerf, right? A big part of Legacy of the Void, for better or for worse, has been being able to fly your tanks around, which in my opinion was really dumb. I thought that was gimmicky. There was some interesting micro, but especially in TVT, it just felt silly. Flying siege tanks, that kind of defeats the purpose. But siege tank damage is increased from 35 to 40, with 15 additional damage against armor. So 70 damage a shot against armored units, and it has slightly longer attack speed, but it does have more HP. So the idea is, because of partly the changes to the Cyclone as a more mobile unit that can be used in the early mid-game or in against small groups of units, the siege tank is almost more of a static defense or pushing unit, because, of course, the time you need to siege up. So, I like this change. It might seem like a big nerf, but really when you combine it with the Cyclone changes and some of the other changes we'll see in a moment, it definitely changes the style and the feel of mech. But in my opinion, I like the design change. and I like how powerful siege tanks feel when you put them in the right spot. So it's a big change. You got to get used to no longer flying siege tanks, but I think everybody will like that in the long run, especially the idea behind it. Now, the battlecruiser, the energy bar has been removed. Abilities no longer require energy. Instead, each ability uses a separate cooldown, 71 seconds. So this means you can tactical jump and then use Yamato cannon, but you still have to research weaponry fit for Yamato. But it gives battlecruisers more mobility, less weakness. They can't get like feedback or anything. They can use more abilities. It still doesn't really make the battlecruiser like a core unit, but it gives it a little bit more going on. So maybe we'll see some more battlecruisers, even though it still doesn't make that unit go from never used to gotta get me some battlecruisers right now. But it does make for some interesting one-base battlecruiser rush opportunities. So at least we got that going. Thor Javelin missiles, anti-air splash attack increased from 0.5 to 0.6, which increases the spread of the splash damage, makes them a little bit more useful against mutalisks, against air units in general, because you can hit more, and the Thor is more kind of an anti-air platform and a really tanky unit in the core of your mech army, because one of the biggest weaknesses of mech is... now, this is important. Let's just go through the changes, because they all kind of combine together with all the major changes. I'm trying to talk one at a time, but you got to kind of get a whole picture first. Banshee remove fusion core requirement for hyperflight rotor, so you can get it quicker. Viking ground mode now has bonus +8 versus mech damage. Now, mech units are not just Terran factory units. They're also SCVs, and for Protoss, Stalkers, and Immortals, and maybe Sentries and Probes, I'm not 100% sure, but there are several, and Colossi as well. There are several mechanical units from Protoss, so this increases the ability of the Viking to be useful, not just as an anti-air, but also an anti-ground unit in these compositions. The Liberator, remove plus light damage for anti-air attack, so that's a straight nerf. Raven, auto turret damage is increased significantly, 16 to 24. This means it 2 shots every worker, by the way. 2 shots every worker, and does significantly more damage in general. Seeker Missile, add a new upgrade, recalibrated explosives, increases tracking range by 50%, and increases damage by 30%. So what this means, you lock a Seeker Missile on, unless that thing is locked on to like a Zergling, or a Stim Marine or Hellion, they're probably not getting away. That Seeker Missile is going to connect. So it gives the ability of Ravens to really front load their damage more. We're just going to talk about all these changes together. We're going to talk about them like in a group, not in a vacuum. But between the additional anti-air capabilities of the Thor, the nerf to the anti-air capabilities of the Liberator, it's clear the Thor is going to be more kind of a little bit like a siege tank, where it doesn't move very quickly, or you could use medevacs to move it, remember, as anti-air. And the Viking is anti-air, whereas the Liberator is more like an anti-ground unit and zone control. Kind of like a flying siege tank almost, because now the anti-air capability is next to nothing. The Viking change also allows you to be a little bit more mobile as well, because you catch a mech army out of position, or you need to pick off a siege tank or two, and that +8 on the ground is actually significant. That means it does almost nearly 50% more damage against mech units than it currently does. So when, of course, those Vikings are on the ground. And all the Raven changes kind of add in, where it's a much more viable option, especially with a mech army, to have 2 or 3 Ravens in there. Not because of the Seeker Missile upgrade. That's not really something that factors in. But just the auto turret increased damage makes it more worth it to have a few Ravens, and that allows you to move your siege tanks up and stuff like that. So they can get sieged up while being covered by cyclones. And now you'll notice here, there are no changes to bio units. And in TVT, and in all the matchups in general, I feel like this does, on the test map, mean a lot more focus on mech. I think over time, bio and mech will have their places, and I think we'll see a different combination of bio and mech units. On the test map right now, and I assume tomorrow when this patch goes live, we're going to see a lot more mech play, but I think over time, it doesn't outright eliminate bio. Of course, we have Zerg and we have Protoss to go through, but it definitely makes mech a lot stronger and things like the design of the siege tank no longer flying around and stuff like that, I think it makes Terran a lot more diverse. It almost feels like two different races right now between Bio and Mech, which is interesting. So overall, I think good changes, and I think definitely going to mix up the style of play you see out of Terran. And now up to Zerg. Similar to our goals with Terran, our main objective with Zerg is to improve the diversity of unit compositions. We would like to achieve a good balance between Roach, Ravager, Zergling, Baneling, and Hydralisk-based play while words are hard. I have the best words. While empowering some of the underutilized support units such as Swarm Hosts and Infestors. The Hydralisk is being transformed into a core tech option for Zerg. Once again, I made the mistake of doing this with Terran. We'll talk about the major changes, but we're going to try to talk about the changes as a whole as opposed to each unit individually because you don't have the whole picture yet. We got to paint that whole picture. Upgrade split. Muscular Augments is being buffed and split into 2 upgrades. Evolved Muscular Augments is 150-150, and it increases base movement speed by 25%. Now, it did this before. The difference is this 25% increase also affects Hydras on creep. Before, Hydras did not get any benefit once they had the speed upgrade from being on or off creep. But now the Hydralisk actually moves faster than it did on creep, whereas after the upgrade it moves the same speed as after the upgrade before. Just that's the difference here. So that is a buff. And Evolved Groove Spines is 100-100, same research time, and increases the attack range by +2. Before it did +1. The upgrades were combined, so it was cheaper, but you got less benefit from the move speed because it didn't do more on creep, and it only did +1 range. That +2 range is very significant. For example, a Marine has 5 range, a Stalker has 6 range, a Hydralisk will now have 7. And that's really nice for especially sniping off things like air units as well. So overall, just a solid buff to the Hydralisk. And it does, especially in the matchups of Zerg versus Protoss and to an extent Zerg versus Terran, make it much more of a core unit like they're talking about. Alright, we got major changes. The Infestor and the Swarm Host. Infestor can now cast all abilities while burrowed. This means you can Fungal and Neural Parasite. Grants a collision radius. Radius is smaller than when unburrowed. So this means you can't go through units, or sometimes becomes obvious, so it's a little bit of a nerf to the Infestor when it comes to moving while burrowed. And that's kind of necessary because otherwise it's just a straight all-out buff. Getting hit by fungals from burrowed Infestors is going to take a while to get used to, and it's going to get real annoying for a few weeks. But I think overall people will adapt to it, but it does just make the Infestor that much stronger. Because instead of just like burrowed Banes, maybe you killed 20 Marines, now you can fungal a massive chunk of the army and they might not even see it coming. So it's going to be annoying. People are going to take a lot of damage and possibly just outright die to it for a little while. But it's just something you got to keep in the back of your mind. And Zerg players, get that burrow upgrade. And the Swarm Host. Cost decreased from 150, 100 to 175. The swoop range increased from 4 to 6, and acid spit weapon damage decreased slightly from 12 to 10. So what this means is the Swarm Host is just dirt cheap right now. You can build plenty of Swarm Hosts. You can throw away 5 Swarm Hosts, not a big deal. It's barely more than the cost of 5 Hydras, and 5 Hydras are not the end of the world if you lose them, whereas before, losing 500 gas was a big deal. But while that's a buff, I think the bigger buff is the increase to swoop range. It might not seem like a big deal from 4 to 6, but now Locust can swoop down and begin doing damage outside of the range of a Marine, or even with the range of a Stalker. So it allows you to have more effective range on those Locusts, because pretty much what Swarm Hosts were before, they were an expensive way to either do a lot of damage or do nothing. Because the Swarm Host, because the swoop range was so low, either you like got into a mineral line and killed all the SCVs, or they all got killed before they really did anything. But this allows the Swarm Host to trade a little bit more. It allows you to be more effective from a longer distance for less investment. So it's just a straight buff to the Swarm Host, besides the slight damage reduction. But the thing is, the Locusts are much more likely to do damage now with the swoop range increase. So, remember, you can manually cast swoop, Zerg players, by the way. You can use that Z key as the hotkey to swoop in certain locations instead of just like trying to aim move and see what you get. So work on that Swarm Host micro. But honestly, I like the unit, especially against Mech Terran now. Let's just go into these simple changes before I talk completely about Zerg. Baneling Centrifugal Hooks now increases health by +10. So once you get that lair and you research Baneling Speed is what Centrifugal Hooks is. It's what makes them move faster. They also get +10 HP, so that's a significant buff. They had 30 before. It goes to 40. Broodlord range decrease from 11 to 10. That's to even out with the Thor range and make Broodlords less of an uncounterable option, though it's not a major impact. Ultra's base armor increased from 1 to 2. Chitinous plating armor decreased from +4 to +2. Now this is a nerf overall, but it's a good design change in my opinion, kind of like the siege tank. So the final result of this is the Ultralist now starts with 2 armor instead of just the 1, but after chitinous plating it has only 2 additional armor. So this means it has a max armor value with +3 carapace of 7 now instead of 8. Now that might not sound like a big deal, but because of the way armor works, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it takes away damage from units' attacks. And the big problem that a lot of people had with the Ultra were just, especially in Zerg vs. Terran, almost exclusively in Zerg vs. Terran, but in Zerg vs. Terran, Marine Marauder just couldn't touch it because the armor was so strong that it was almost unbreakable. Even just this 1 overall armor decrease makes it a lot easier. I've played personally against it and with it, but it makes it a lot more possible. Like, you have 30 supply of bio, you're not going to die to 1 Ultra anymore. As long as you've been keeping up on upgrades and such. But it does feel a lot more counterable, but it's also a slight buff to the Ultralisk because before you had the armor upgrade, before you had that +4 for chitinous plating, they were paperless. They get popped. Like pretty much a very, very expensive balloon. So now you have a little bit more ability to just immediately make Ultras. But especially Terran with bio has a little bit more counterplay there. But once again, the Baneling with increased HP is a little bit of a counter on that. Overall, I'm just going to run through the matchups. This has very little change on ZVZ. ZVC is still Ling Bane into Roaches or maybe Mutas. Usually Roaches, but you don't really see a lot of these coming into play. Just because ZVZ is a much lower economy, low-tech matchup compared to the other matchups. But ZVT, especially against Mech, we see the most dramatic changes. My preferred style is like a Ling Bane into Hydralisk against both Bio and Mech. And if they're really heavy on the Mech, I like to go with the Swarm Host to really deal with those sieged up tanks from afar and do a lot of decent harass. If they're going for Bio, I usually like to go more towards the Infestors and really heavy Banelings because you got that Burrow Fungal. And you can go to Hive Tech a bit quicker. Either way, the Infestation Pit becoming a much stronger follow-up in the mid-game as well. Remember, you got that +10 HP to Banelings as well, which does make it a lot more difficult for Bio to straight-up micro, which is why Siege Tanks are going to become so important because they can kill those Banelings. Overall, we'll have to see, but it does make Zerg, for the most part, feel a lot swarmier. That's a technical term, swarmier. But you're really focused on making, putting, not necessarily very strong units, but trying to hit from different angles, get on top of armies, and this gives you a little bit more ability to hit multiple angles, especially with the buff to the Swarm Host and the range on the Hydralisk, and defend as well. So it's an overall buff to most styles of Zerg play, and it makes them feel, once again, I'm going to use that technical term, swarmier. So I like that, because that's really the style I like, is just pumping out wave after wave after wave of units and hitting them and hitting them and hitting them, as opposed to, I'm going to turtle, and then I'm going to get 3 Ultras, and then I'm going to win the game. It's not that fun. So that's my opinion on those changes. Alright, and finally we have Protoss. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, before we even get into this, I feel of the changes, I feel it's an overall buff to Terran, it's an overall buff to Zerg, though it's a stylistic change to Zerg, whereas it's just a straight buff to Mech. I feel like Protoss is the weakest of the races after all these changes. We're going to talk about the changes, but from my experience, I played hundreds of games of these changes now, at pretty much the Grandmaster level for the most part. And Protoss definitely feels the weakest. I'll talk about why, but let's look at the changes first. For Protoss, our emphasis lies in two places: even out the strengths of the race's harassment options and increase the combined power of Stargate play. Changes to the Tempest Carrier and Void Ray serve to bolster Stargate units, while alterations to many of the Protoss harassment units should balance out their backline capabilities. So when they say alterations, what they mean, for the most part, is nerfs. It's overall nerfs to your standard harassment options. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But of any of the races, Protoss was the only race to pretty much get straight nerfs to several of the units. So, let's look at the new Tempest, the unit redesign. I would argue this isn't so much of a redesign here on the Tempest as it is like for the Cyclone or the Hydralisk, I guess. But the new Tempest role versus air remains the same, while it is becoming more of a utility spellcaster versus ground units. Its new ability Disruption Blast stuns ground units in a radius about the size of a force field for 7 seconds, giving an accompanying Protoss army a window to move in and lay waste. Now you might be like, well, that sounds ridiculously imba. Now let me tell you why it's not that big of a deal. Supply count increased from 4 to 6, which means just in general, you can make less Tempests. Like Tempests, you can't put as many on the field. They'll take up a much larger amount of your army. Just having, let's say you had 4 Tempests before, 16 supply, 4 Tempests now, 24. Which is 4 more Charge Lots, or 4 more Templar, stuff like that. The Tempest is now more of a support unit, kind of like the Sentry, where you don't really want to have too many, but you want to have a few if it's the composition you're going for. So, ground attack damage increased from 30 to 35, but ground attack range decreased from 15 to 8, and this is a significant nerf. The Tempest is no longer that long-range ground siege unit. It still has the same air attack range, so it can still take out things like Broodlords and Carriers, and they're more of a specialty unit for that. But its anti-ground attack is relatively negligible because it's so easy to just kill the Tempest if it gets close. Now, the big change here is the new ability Disruption Blast. The cast range is 10, which is pretty long. The radius is 1.95, just for comparison, it's about the size of a force field. The cooldown is 43 seconds, and the cast time is 4 seconds. And it stuns units. It doesn't freeze them, it doesn't put them in stasis, it stuns them. So if those units are caught in the Disruption Blast, they cannot move, they cannot cast, they cannot attack, they must sit there, and they must take it. No joke, no mother jokes here. We're just gonna blast right past that. Disruption Blast. So it's a long cast time. It's a 4-second channel. They can see you casting it, and there's an indicator on the ground where the blast is going to be. It's still not bad. If you time it out at the right time, like right as a fight starts, you can usually land it on a decent chunk of units, and it can turn a fight. So it's a really strong ability. But it's difficult to both like justify the investment of Tempest over, we're going to get to the Carrier, and also just justify having a Tempest and trying to use Disruption Blast over a lot of other anti-ground capabilities. So I'd say this is an overall nerf to the Tempest. It is a change, but it's an overall nerf, just because it no longer has the anti-ground siege capability. Now, of course, they're replacing that with a couple other things. There are changes to the Carrier and changes to the Void Ray, which are pretty dramatic. Alright, major changes. The Carrier. Ability Release Interceptors has been removed. Interceptors cost now reduced from 25 minerals to 5 minerals. Build Interceptor is now set to autocast by default. So, in my opinion, this is an overall buff to the Carrier, though it is a change. Release Interceptors was pretty much, the way Blizzard described it and the way I think they did it accurately is, there's no reason not to release Interceptors during a fight. Even though it might cost you money, it would just add that blanket DPS near the start of a fight, and there was like no decision made on how you would use the Carrier. You just dump your Interceptors, then you keep the Carrier alive. This makes it now a lot more of a focus. Instead of just gunning down all the Interceptors with a bunch of Marines or with Hydralisks or something. You have to kill the Carrier, otherwise there's really, like, those Interceptors are coming back. It only costs 40 minerals to fill up a Carrier now. which is dirt cheap. So the real focus on the carrier is killing the carrier. This doesn't really solve the issue of what if they just built nearly 200 supply of High Templar, Archons, Carriers, and Tempests. There's still that issue. But overall, the carrier becomes a little bit more of an interesting unit in the mid-game because the focus does have to be on killing the carrier and not just moving into the interceptors and killing them all because they're so expensive. I still don't know how I feel about this change. I think I like it for Protoss, but as the other races, it feels like you lost a decent chunk of your options. So, in my opinion, it's going to make Skytoss a little bit more annoying. We'll see. Now here's the one that people are going to freak out about, but they really shouldn't. Dark Templar, new ability, Blink. Yes, it's called Shadow Stride. It's Blink. It's a Blink. It's effectively a Blink. It costs 100. You research it at the Dark Shrine, not at the Twilight Council. It's not tied in the Stalker Blink. It does cost the same amount of time, but you have to get a Dark Shrine. Then you have to spend more time than it takes to build the already long building Dark Shrine in order to research Shadow Stride. No, it's Blink. It has a long cooldown. It's almost double the Stalker Blink, which is about 11 or 12 seconds. Instantly teleports the DT a short distance and emits a plume of smoke. And that plume of smoke is because sometimes you can't see a Dark Templar, so it makes it difficult to see where it blinked to, right? Unlike a Stalker. So that's just an animation, so you're not completely blind. But this isn't really a big deal. It's, once again, kind of like the Tempest now. It's a little bit hard to justify the cost of going for maybe DTs with Blink over just by the time you get it, either a lot of charge lots or some adepts or something like that. So, it's a nice harassment option, but it's not like, I'm going to rush DT Blink, because the quickest you can get it out, even on one base, is like 6 minutes, which is already solidly mid-game. So I think we'll see some cool play with that. It's going to feel like bullshit the first time you play against it, or maybe the third time, but it's really not that big of a deal. It's a cool addition. It's a mid to late game addition, so it gives Protoss some more harassment options. Not that I think they particularly needed them at that stage of the game, but there you go. Simple changes. The Zealot base movement speed from charge increased by about 10-ish%. So this means not the charge, but once you research charge, the Zealot already moves faster. This means it will move even faster. This is to counterattack, I guess a little bit extra counterplay for mech, which is kind of immobile. So you can run around it a little bit easier. And to catch up with things like the new Hydra. It's a good buff. I think it was pretty necessary for charge. Adept Shade Vision reduced from 9 to 2. This is a huge nerf. This is a massive nerf. And this is probably the most dramatic of all the changes of Protoss in general. Is now Adepts are no longer really a utility unit, like to be used for scouting or to do damage. Now, I know nobody was a huge fan of how Adepts could pretty much effectively be in two places at once with next to no risk. But the Adept was a lot of the reason a Protoss player was able to expand and maybe be aggressive in the early mid-game, especially against Terran and against Zerg. And now, without the Shade Vision, you're effectively blind. You can see, you have to be breathing down their neck with your Shade in order to get vision. You have to just face check into a wall or something to see what's there. 2 vision is nothing. So it's a big nerf to the Adept. As a fighting unit, as part of your army composition, it's no change, because as you get later into the game, if you're making Adepts as part of your army, you probably have vision from other tools or anything like that. But in the early mid-game, it's a pretty big nerf. Now, we have also a pretty big buff here. Is Void Ray speed is increased from 3.15 to 3.5, which is another over 10% increase here. And that allows the Void Ray to move around a lot quicker, do damage in different locations, and defend different locations. And I think it honestly, especially against the mech openers from Terran, but also when it comes to unit compositions and Protoss versus Protoss, and to an extent Protoss versus Zerg, it allows the Void Ray to go. Now, I know Void Rays masked up are annoying at the lower levels especially, but the reason Void Rays aren't used very often at the highest levels like Grandmaster, like pro games, is just because they're very easy to counter once you realize they're a threat. Sure, 6 Void Rays showing up is always going to be strong, but the Void Ray was a relatively slow unit. It was hard to justify making a Void Ray instead of like a Phoenix or another Oracle or something. But now, if the Void Ray can move around and deal with harassment and be a viable part of your relatively quick army, say with Adepts or something like that, then it has a lot more utility. So the Void Ray has kind of replaced, to an extent, the Adept as your early mid-game defense and sometimes offense, which is good. I don't think it balances out. I don't think it makes up for the Adept nerf, and we'll see here in 1 second, the Warp Prism health nerf from 100 to 80. It still has 100 shield, so it's a 20 HP. It's a 10% nerf overall. Makes the Warp Prism a little bit easier to kill, and I think we can all get on board with that. Because the Warp Prism... The problem with a Warp Prism as compared to like a Medevac or an Overlord or other forms of harassment, you can warp in 2 Adepts, or you could suddenly warp in 15 charge lots in someone's base. So the Warp Prism becomes this almost GG level tool that, as an air unit, is still pretty difficult to kill. So this is to reduce that a little bit somewhat and make it less of a potentially game-ending situation if a Warp Prism gets close to you. A little bit easier to kill. I think it's a good nerf. I think there should be more risk for the potential reward of a Warp Prism. So I like that overall. I think they did what they set out to do, which is increase the viability of Protoss in all the matchups. Of Stargate for Protoss in all the matchups. I feel right now Protoss is the weakest race, not because of how strong the carrier is, or how strong Void Rays are, or Zealots, but the reliance on going for Stargate or going for these tech options means that Protoss has very little in that early mid-game when they're trying to get to 2 or 3 bases, and that's exactly where the biggest buffs to Terran and Zerg came, which is like right when Lair hits and you're able to get better Hydralisks, or very strong siege tanks, or the option of Cyclones with mech. So Protoss right now does feel kind of like they're in a state of, I have to not die, not die, not die. Now I have a bunch of carriers. Like, so I like the design changes to Terran. I like the design changes to Zerg. I actually really like Zerg, where they went with it. I think Zerg was really well done. But the changes to Protoss make it feel more like Wings of Liberty, kind of death ball play. Because you need to build up to these very strong units. You need to survive until you get DT Blink or Charge. So, honestly, I'm not too sure of what I would do to change that. But I think it kind of compounds the issue of Protoss kind of just being a death ball race, rather than going the other direction like they kind of did with the other races. So, Protoss players, it's not like you can't play anymore. Alright, you're going to have to adjust your style a little bit if you're big into carriers or Stargate units. And obviously, everybody loves carriers, one of the most iconic units in Starcraft history. It's not like Protoss is impossible to play. I just feel like the gameplay style I like to play, especially, which is pretty much heavy economy, just not really death ball, but being able to hit multiple locations and harass different bases while attacking. I like to multitask and do multi-pronged attacks and stuff, and I think overall it's a little bit harder to do that with Protoss. So that's my I guess analysis of the situation. That is my feelings on the patch. Once again, we're gonna run it down. We'll just go through the full summary. We've got the patch notes. We got the new maps. We've got Nova Covert Ops. We've got the new co-op map as well. And of course, the biggest ones that I am talking about, the multiplayer changes. But for Terran, we've got the change to the Cyclone as kind of a mech marauder, allowing you to be a little bit more mobile before you get siege tanks, which cannot be lifted by medevacs, remember, but have a lot more damage. On top of just overall utility being added to most other mech units like the Viking, the Raven, the Thor, and the Banshee. So, just stronger mech in general. No nerfs to bio, but nerfs by buffs to other types of units. Like for example, the Baneling and Hydralisk buffs for Zerg, the Siege Tank buff for Terran, makes bio a little bit of an obvious choice and a lot more of a specific choice in the matchups, which I like. For Zerg, Hydralisk, a very lair tech heavy army, which is my favorite type of army, with a nerf to just turtling to hive tech, with a nerf to broodlords and ultras, and a buff to these lair tech units. So I'm excited for that style. And then Protoss with changes to the carrier and changes to the Tempest, and a lot of mid to late game buffs with like DT Blink and charge speed upgrade. But overall, nerfs to the standard early mid-game with Adept Shade Vision being effectively cut out and it being a very risky move to just shade in unless you know for sure what's ahead of you. The Warp Prism nerf, a buff to the Void Ray, but that gives you a little bit more aggressive potential. So Protoss definitely a little bit more defensive in my opinion, and just trying to survive until they get this lair tech. So... not really lair tech, but the equivalent of lair tech, rather. So, I think I like the changes to Zerg the most because it really pushes Zerg more towards the style I personally like to play. Once again, these are mostly stylistic, as opposed to... Actually, for Zerg, a lot of them are straight buffs, but only to certain units that are not being used as much, like the Hydralisk, the Infestor, and the Swarm Host. For Terran, they're stylistic changes in the sense that now it's a focus on mech instead of bio. And for Protoss, a little bit more defensive with a focus on unit composition and getting these critical upgrades in order to be able to fight later on. So, overall, I think it's a good patch, and I know Blizzard's going to be looking at it very closely as we're all playing on the ladder over the next few weeks. I like it. I like the idea, and I like that they were willing to make such dramatic changes as well. But I'll be playing on stream. If you guys don't know, you can find my stream link below. Or every time I spam your YouTube inbox with the stream live thing. And of course, the games I'll be uploading will be on this patch. On top of, if you have any comments or questions, I'll do my best to answer them below as well. But thank you guys for watching the StarCraft update. This is Winter covering the most major balance patch and just overall StarCraft patch since Legacy of the Void came out. Thank you guys for watching. Good luck, have fun, and happy StarCraft, and I'll see you next time.